Have you ever just gotten totally lost scrolling on your phone?
Yeah.
Where you're like, whoa, where did the last hour go?
Oh yeah, totally.
Or maybe, you plan to have one cookie and suddenly the whole pack is gone.
Yeah, I think we've all been there.
We've all been there. And at the heart of all that is this powerful brain chemical called dopamine.
Dopamine.
It's like our reward system,
Yeah.
but kind of on overdrive in our modern world.
Right.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into dopamine, what it is, how it works, and how it's sort of being hijacked by all the pings and notifications and, just the digital life that we live in.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because dopamine is actually essential for our survival. It pushes us towards things that help us thrive and, keep us going. But as you said, things have gotten a bit more complex now with the way technology has, sort of woven itself into our lives.
Right. It's almost like this invisible force pulling us towards our screens.
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that, let's break down some basics. What exactly is dopamine?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, essentially a chemical messenger that zips between neurons in our brain. You can think of it like a tiny signal, carrying messages that influence everything from how we feel pleasure to how we learn and even how we move.
Wow, so one tiny chemical is doing all that.
Yeah, it's a pretty busy little molecule.
That's pretty mind-blowing. But how does this all connect to the whole reward system we hear so much about?
Well, our brains are hardwired to, seek out pleasure and avoid pain.
Right.
It's a basic survival mechanism. So when we do something pleasurable, like, eating a delicious meal or achieving a goal, our brain releases a burst of dopamine.
Okay.
This dopamine rush basically tells our brain, hey, that felt good, let's do that again.
Mm-hmm.
So it reinforces those behaviors, making us want to repeat them.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like our brain giving us a little pat on the back and saying good job, you survived.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the way this actually works in the brain is through pathways. You can think of them like a complex highway system, right?
Uh-huh.
And one of the most important pathways is the mesolimbic pathway. It's often called the reward pathway. It connects the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, think of it like the dopamine factory,
Right.
to the nucleus accumbens, which is our brain's pleasure center.
So when we do something rewarding, the VTA, the factory, sends out a surge of dopamine along this highway, straight to the pleasure zone.
You got it, but it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
There's another key pathway called the mesocortical pathway.
Okay.
This one connects the VTA to the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain responsible for things like planning, decision-making, thinking ahead. This pathway helps us learn from our experiences and figure out how to get more of those rewarding feelings in the future. So it's not just about, immediate pleasure. It's also about long-term strategy.
Interesting. So one pathway is all about instant gratification, and then the other one's more like a long-term investment strategy for happiness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of where things start to go a little haywire in our modern, hyper-connected world.
Okay. So our world is now flooded with things that just constantly trigger these dopamine pathways, right?
Right.
Social media, junk food, video games. It's like they're designed to give us these quick and easy bursts of dopamine.
Yeah, and the problem is this constant bombardment can overstimulate our brains.
Right.
It's like we're building up a tolerance, needing more and more stimulation to kind of get that same level of satisfaction.
Yeah, so instead of those things being like an occasional treat, they become almost like necessities. We need them just to feel normal.
Precisely. It's like our brains become desensitized to the everyday things that used to bring us joy.
Right.
Those simple pleasures just don't produce enough dopamine anymore compared to, the super stimulating things we've become accustomed to.
That's a little unsettling. So what happens when we're constantly chasing those dopamine highs?
Mm-hmm.
What are the consequences of this, like overstimulation?
Well, one of the biggest issues is reduced motivation, right? For things that don't offer that instant reward. Think about things like studying or working on a long-term project or even, just chores around the house. They just don't trigger the same dopamine rush as, say, scrolling through TikTok or playing a video game. Mm-hmm. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Remember that neuroscientist we mentioned earlier, TJ Power?
Yeah.
He actually battled addiction by, understanding and kind of hacking this dopamine system.
So are you saying that we can actually rewire our brains to overcome these patterns, that we're not just stuck in this dopamine-driven loop?
Exactly. We can absolutely learn to manage our dopamine and regain control.
Okay.
But before we dive into, the solutions, let's explore some of the challenges of dopamine dysregulation. Have you heard of the TikTok brain?
So definitely. That's like all over the news these days.
Yeah.
But honestly, I thought it was just like a catchy phrase.
Yeah.
What's the actual science behind it?
It's a real phenomenon. The way content is delivered on platforms like TikTok with those short rapid-fire videos, it's designed to just deliver constant dopamine hits. You just keep scrolling for more and more and more.
Right.
And while it's certainly entertaining, it can train our brains to just expect this constant stimulation.
Right.
And it makes it much harder to, focus on things that require sustained attention, like reading a book or having a deep conversation.
So it's not just about procrastination. It's actually like changing how our brains function.
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
So we've talked about how this constant dopamine stimulation can really, rewire our brains, making it harder to focus and find motivation for anything that doesn't offer that instant gratification.
Right.
And it's a bit daunting, to be honest.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that there are ways to regain control, right?
Yeah.
Like this TJ Power story, for example. Can you tell us more about how he actually managed to overcome his addictions? Because that sounds incredibly hopeful.
Yeah, so TJ Power's story is a great example of how, understanding dopamine can really empower us to make, real changes in our lives.
Okay.
He struggled with alcohol and pornography addiction, both of which, as we've discussed, are very heavily tied to dopamine.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that, he used his knowledge of neuroscience to actually develop strategies to retrain his brain.
So he basically used his understanding of dopamine against itself.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's pretty clever. What did he actually do?
So one of his key strategies was something called a dopamine fast, or more accurately, a dopamine reset.
Okay, a dopamine fast. I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's not about completely eliminating dopamine.
Right.
That would be impossible. And as we've established, dopamine is actually essential for a lot of crucial functions.
Yeah.
The idea is to strategically reduce your exposure to those hyper-stimulating activities that we've been talking about, right? That lead to those excessive dopamine spikes. Think social media, video games, junk food, all those things we've been discussing.
So giving your brain a break from the constant bombardment.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that be incredibly difficult? I mean, those things are so ingrained in our lives.
It certainly takes effort, but it's not about going cold turkey.
Okay.
It's about finding a balance that works for you. The goal is to help your brain become more sensitive to those everyday pleasures again, right?
Okay.
The things that bring genuine joy without the need for that, intense dopamine rush.
Gotcha. So how do you actually do that? Where do you even begin?
We'll start by identifying the activities you suspect are, maybe overstimulating your reward system. Then experiment with setting some limits, right? For example, instead of, endless social media scrolling, maybe dedicate a specific 30 minutes a day.
Okay.
Or instead of daily junk food, maybe make it a once-a-week treat. It's about being mindful and intentional.
So it's not about deprivation. It's about being more conscious of our choices.
Exactly. And while you're kind of cutting back on the hyper-stimulating stuff,
Right.
start incorporating more activities that actually provide those natural sources of pleasure, right?
Yeah.
Things like spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones, pursuing creative hobbies, learning something new. All these things actually release dopamine, but in a more balanced, sustainable way.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's like a two-pronged approach, reducing the bad and increasing the good.
Yeah.
But how long does this dopamine reset need to last? Is there like a magic number?
There's no magic number. Some people might find a day or two is enough to feel a shift.
Okay.
While others might need a week or longer.
Right.
It really depends on, your individual needs and habits. The key is to listen to your body and kind of adjust accordingly.
Okay.
Remember, it's a personal experiment, not a strict regimen.
Right, right. This is starting to feel a lot less overwhelming.
Good.
It's about making, gradual, sustainable changes, not trying to overhaul my entire life overnight.
Yeah.
But how do we make those changes stick? How do we avoid falling back into those old patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question. Building sustainable habits is really crucial.
Okay.
And one of the most effective strategies is setting, small, achievable goals.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of trying to completely eliminate a behavior.
Right.
Focus on reducing it gradually.
Okay.
For example, if you want to, cut back on social media, start by reducing your usage by 15 minutes a day.
Okay.
Each small victory actually releases a little bit of dopamine, which reinforces that positive behavior.
So it's like we're hacking our own reward system.
Yeah, exactly.
Using dopamine to our advantage.
Precisely.
I like that.
And another important aspect is, creating a supportive environment.
Okay.
Surround yourself with people who, encourage your positive choices, make it easier to engage in those healthy activities, right?
Right.
If you're trying to cut back on junk food, well, clear those tempting snacks out of your pantry. If you want to exercise more, lay out your workout clothes the night before. Little things like that can make a big difference.
I've heard that having a workout buddy can really help with accountability too.
Absolutely.
It's much harder to skip that gym session when you know someone is waiting for you.
Yeah, that sense of social connection is incredibly powerful.
Right.
And speaking of connection, one thing that often gets overlooked in our discussion of dopamine is the power of mindfulness.
Mindfulness. That's like a huge buzzword these days. But how does it actually relate to dopamine?
Well, when we're constantly bombarded with stimulation, it's easy to lose touch with our senses and, just take those simple pleasures for granted.
Right.
Mindfulness actually helps us reconnect with those things.
Okay.
Imagine, savoring the taste of your food, feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin, noticing the beauty of nature around you. These little moments of, mindful awareness can actually bring a sense of peace and joy that doesn't rely on that intense dopamine rush.
It's like we're retraining our brains to appreciate the subtleties, the little things that often go unnoticed.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a sense of, gratitude and contentment in the present moment.
Right.
Which can actually help regulate dopamine over time.
Okay.
But remember, changing habits takes time and effort. There will inevitably be times when we slip up, when those old patterns resurface.
That's reassuring to hear, actually.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, myself included, get discouraged when they have a setback and think, well, I guess I just can't do it.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that those slip-ups are normal. They're part of the process.
Absolutely. They're not failures. They're actually opportunities for learning and growth.
Okay.
The key is to be kind to yourself and view those moments with curiosity rather than judgment. Ask yourself, what triggered this behavior? What could I do differently next time? Use those slip-ups as a chance to, refine your strategies and strengthen your resolve.
So instead of throwing in the towel, we can actually use those moments to become more aware of our patterns and make adjustments. That's a much more empowering perspective.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to have the knowledge. It's another to actually put it into practice.
Right.
Are there any other tools or techniques that can help us on this journey of reclaiming our focus and motivation? Wow. It's like we've uncovered this, like the secret world inside our brains.
Yeah.
This whole interplay of dopamine and reward.
It's pretty fascinating.
It's fascinating, but it's also kind of intimidating to realize how much power these things have over, our daily lives.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in a world that's designed to constantly grab our attention and keep us hooked.
It's true. I mean, we're basically living in a giant dopamine playground, right?
Right.
But that doesn't mean we're powerless.
Okay.
One of the most effective strategies for regaining control, and this might sound a little counterintuitive, is learning to delay gratification.
Delay gratification. Okay. That sounds almost impossible in our world of instant everything.
Yeah.
How can we possibly resist those immediate rewards that are just constantly
Right.
beckoning us?
Yeah. It's definitely a skill that takes practice, but think about it this way. When we constantly give in to those instant urges, we're basically weakening our willpower muscle.
Right.
But when we consciously choose to delay gratification, we actually strengthen that muscle. And over time, those small acts of resistance can have a huge impact on our ability to focus, make better decisions, and ultimately achieve our goals.
So it's like we're building mental discipline.
Exactly.
Instead of being ruled by our impulses, we're learning to be more intentional.
Right. And here's a little secret. When you actually delay gratification, the reward itself often becomes more enjoyable.
Really?
You've earned it. You've built anticipation, and you're more likely to really savor the experience.
That makes sense. It's like waiting for something you really, really want. The anticipation actually adds to the pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's be realistic. We're not going to be perfect at this.
Oh, of course not.
There will be times when we slip up, when we give in to temptation.
Right.
How do we deal with those moments?
The key is to not beat yourself up about it.
Okay.
Slip-ups are going to happen. They're part of the process.
Right.
What really matters is how you respond to them,
Right.
Instead of viewing those slip-ups as failures, Try to see them as opportunities for learning and growth. Ask yourself, what happened? What triggered me? What could I do differently next time?
Okay.
It's about using those slip-ups as valuable data points, almost like a feedback loop for your own behavior.
And it sounds like self-compassion is a big part of this.
Absolutely. Be kind to yourself throughout this whole process,
Yeah.
Recognize that changing those deeply ingrained habits takes time and it takes effort. And remember, you don't have to do this alone.
Right.
There are so many resources out there. Therapists, coaches, support groups, even apps that can help you track your progress and stay motivated.
It's good to know that there's support out there.
Yeah.
But even with all these strategies, the dopamine resets, the habit building, the mindfulness, the delayed gratification,
Yeah.
it can still feel overwhelming.
Sure.
Where do we even begin? Like, what's one small step that our listeners can take today to start reclaiming their focus and their motivation?
If you're feeling overwhelmed, I would say start with one very simple thing. Notice.
Right.
Just start paying attention to how you feel, what you're doing, and how different activities affect your mood, your energy levels. Notice when you feel that pull toward those quick dopamine hits,
Yeah.
Notice when you feel more present, more engaged in the moment.
All right.
This simple act of awareness is really the foundation for making any kind of positive changes.
It all starts with awareness.
Exactly.
Like we're finally shining a light on these unconscious patterns that have been, running our lives.
Right.
So to our listeners, take a moment today to just notice what's happening in your world, both internally and externally. And as you become more aware of your own patterns and behaviors, remember that you have the power to choose differently.
You do.
You can choose to engage in activities that nourish your mind, your body, and your spirit.
That's right.
You can choose to cultivate joy and contentment in the present moment. And you can choose to create a life that feels truly aligned with your values and aspirations. This has been such a fascinating exploration of dopamine.
Yes.
We've learned so much about how this powerful chemical influences our motivations, our behaviors, and ultimately our well-being.
It's really incredible.
And while the modern world definitely presents its fair share of, dopamine-fueled distractions,
Right.
we've also discovered that we have the power to reclaim our focus and our motivation.
Absolutely.
It's a journey, not a destination. Be patient with yourself, celebrate your progress, and don't be afraid to ask for support along the way. We're all kind of navigating this complex world together, striving to create lives that feel meaningful and fulfilling. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question. Knowing what you now know about dopamine, what's one small change you can make today to reclaim your focus, boost your motivation, and start creating the life you truly desire? So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question. That's all for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another insightful exploration of the world around us. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.